Two.
Hello and welcome everybody to this week's edition of Truth to Power here on your community radio station. We are WFMP-LP Louisville, broadcasting from the top of the Hayburn building at 106.5 FM and live streaming to the world at forwardradio.org. We'd love for you to go there right now to become a part of this community radio station, either behind the microphones or behind the scenes. It's a volunteer if you click on participate. Or sustain us on the air with your contributions. This is all listener sponsored. That's how we make this thing happen every day of the year. Is your chipping in $20 sponsors an entire day's broadcast here at Forward Radio. So go to forwardradio.org and become a part of this radio magic today. What we do each week on this program here, I'm the host of Sustainability Now, Justin Mogg, but what we do right here on Truth to Power is we gather folks from around the community to talk about important issues of the day. And I'm excited to get Hart Hagan back in the studio with me from the Climate Report and Let's Talk, as well as Jake Bush from DSA Louisville. They're going to be talking with us in a second, but I want to start with a clip because today's topic is Fred Hampton. We're going to talk about perhaps the most important civil rights activist you've never heard of. Maybe you have heard of him. Maybe we're going to dive more into him today, but I wanted to start with just a little clip of Fred in his own words. This is from the 1969 documentary, The Murder of Fred Hampton.
I'm the deputy chairman of the state of Illinois, Black Panther Party, Fred Hampton. And a lot of people don't understand the Black Panther Party's relationship with white mother country radicals. A lot of people don't even understand that word that Elvis uses a lot. But what we're saying is that there are white people in the mother country that are for the same types of things that we are for stimulating revolution in the mother country. And we said that we'll work with anybody and form coalition with anybody that has revolution on their mind. We're not a racist organization because we understand that racism is an excuse used for capitalism. And we know that racism is a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people. And we're going to have to put it back in the hands of the people.
That's a clip of Fred Hampton on revolution and racism and the links to capitalism. And that's what I'm excited to talk today with Jake Bush from DSA Louisville about. Hey, Jake, how are you doing today?
I'm great. I feel like I could punch the moon every time I hear Fred Hampton. I mean, we always talk about, I always talk about his impact. And I think that you have to note his incredible oratory skills. I mean, just that little clip, I'm just sitting here, you saw me, I look like a prize fighter, just getting ready. So I'm great.
Yeah, exactly. I'm so excited to have you here. And hey, Hart, how are you doing?
Hey, Justin, how are you? So Fred Hampton is the threat of a good example. You know, he was murdered because he threatened the establishment because he was a good example. Don't get me started.
Well, let's get started with a little. Okay. Who was Fred Hampton? He was a Black Panther Party leader, a revolutionary socialist in Chicago, one of the great 1960s advocates and, as you heard, orators, and murdered by the FBI in Chicago at age 21.
Murdered in a way that was quite premeditated.
Yeah, tell us more of what you know about it.
Okay, so I first heard the name Fred Hampton from Noam Chomsky, and which was only a couple of years ago when I first started really understanding how the world really works. And then I knew precious little about him until I read a book called The Assassination of Fred Hampton, which was written by Jeffrey Haas, who is still living and was Fred Hampton's attorney in Chicago. They had a law office called PLO, the People's Legal Organization, People's Law Office. So I read that book and I started to understand who Fred Hampton was. I understood that he was killed when he was only 21 years old. He was very talented, very well liked. In my opinion, he could have been the heir. He was the heir apparent to the mantle of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King.
Great.
Yeah.
Very much in those shoes, right? In that style.
Right. And he was a threat to the FBI. We know now that the FBI, plotted the murder of Fred Hampton, and the Chicago police, and even the prosecutor. Like the prosecutor was named was Hanrahan. He orchestrated the raid that ended up in the death of Fred Hampton.
Right.
So we were going to talk about this in 3 stages, and possibly in 3 different episodes. But the 3 stages are: number 1, the life and times of Fred Hampton. Who was he? What was the context of his life and his ministry, if you will? And number 2, the circumstances surrounding his death. And number 3, the aftermath. So the way Jeffrey Haas writes his book is to tell the story from his own perspective, which is the legal cases that occurred afterwards. The people who were in the room, in the house when the police raided it, ended up being charged with crimes as if they were the criminals here. So there was at least 2 criminal trials, and then there was a civil trial. And spoiler alert, that I think it's important to know that from the outset that this resulted in $1.85 million being awarded to the plaintiffs, which included the family of Fred Hampton. There were something like 8 people in the house when he was murdered. And so those people suffered injuries, and the family, so there were 2 people who died, Fred Hampton and the other gentleman's name, Mark Clark, died in the raid. And the reason they were awarded $1.85 million collectively, all their families, is that the court determined that it was more likely than not that their civil rights had been violated. So it's not like, the word conspiracy theory gets on my last nerve, because it's as if it's this whole word that comes with baggage. We're talking about a story that has been established, by beyond, not beyond a reasonable doubt, but anybody looking at it is going to know that it's at least more likely than not that the FBI straight up committed murder. And one thing that's we hear about Watergate and Nixon being deposed basically because of Watergate, but this was a much worse crime on his watch. Not to mention others, but the Democratic and Republican establishment taken together. I mean, Democrats aren't going to nail Nixon for this because, they're...
Well, it's worth noting that Hanrahan and Mayor Daley were also Democrats.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. Good point. So, Jake, were you going to tell us about, kick us off with the first big stage, the life and times?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I wanted to start very briefly, looking at the 1960s in a broader sort of economic and social standpoint. I mean, I don't want to belabor the point, because I think that, anybody listening is going to understand the 1960s was a land of contrasts. Yeah. And, it was a time of mass unrest in a lot of ways. I mean, you had the Vietnam War, you had, of course, the Cold War and everything else. I mean, we all know that. But I wanted to sort of situate an understanding of the 1960s as sort of the high watermark. And we were talking before we began recording about how, I think of Hunter Thompson's famous quote in Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas about how, you can look west and see the high watermark where the waters rose and then rolled back, right? And I always wondered what that meant when I read that book. And now that I'm older, I understand that he was talking about a whole lot of things happening at once. And he was also talking about, maybe whether he knew it or not, that the 1960s, I think we have to understand, was the high watermark for the United States of America as a nation state, as a cohesive unit, having almost unquestioned control of the world market, right? This was where we were producing stuff. We always talk about the good old days when you had union manufacturing jobs and all this stuff. We were making stuff in this country.
So this was when America was great? Is that...
I'm not going to touch that. Justin, you're not going to bait me into that. But that was the moment where the United States really had control over the markets. And I think after the 1960s, and I think beginning in like 68, 69, somewhere around there, you started to see us shifting to a financial model which put powers in multinational corporations that were based in the US, important distinction, but not an arm of the US, right? And I think that, you know, these very educated radicals like Fred Hampton, which is amazing to think he was 21 years old when he died.
Oh, yeah.
That just blows my mind.
Yeah, only
21. And yet I think that he was educated enough and had his finger on the pulse enough to understand changes are coming, whether we want them to or not, whether they're on our terms or not, right?
Well, I think that's because he was part of a movement, right?
He was.
If it was just a 21-year-old Fred Hampton hanging out on the internet like you would today, right?
Well,
maybe it wouldn't be the same. But this is a man who is deeply embedded in a movement, an organized movement of people seeking radical revolutionary change.
And
like is happening today.
Right, and that is the relevance of tying between the late 60s and Hampton himself and today, where you saw at age 17, he's already involved in the youth wing of the NAACP on the outskirts of Chicago, in the suburbs of Chicago, in Maywood is where he lived. 17 years old, he organized 500 kids, right? Try to get 500 kids on the same page for anything. You know what I mean? Much less when you are a kid.
Yeah.
But he did it. He did it.
500 kids in a district that included like 27,000 people. So a total of 27,000 people. Wow. You get 500 kids together and organize them.
Wow.
Yeah, exactly. So he had his finger on the pulse. He was involved. And I think that he understood, like a lot of radicals at the time understood, and I think a lot of radicals now understand, changes are on the way. They're happening right in front of our face. You cannot stop it. You know, it's societal evolution, economic evolution, these things happen whether you want them to or not. It's just a matter of whether or not you have any say in how they change. You know what I mean? And I think that we have to understand this if we're going to understand Hampton. We have to understand that the 1960s was a time where we were at the high water mark. A lot of people understood that. Even people like Hampton who understood we're being oppressed. You know, we are at the bottom of the national barrel. I think he understood, even in spite of that this is as high as it goes unless we make some changes. You know what I mean? So he was involved with the NAACP, like I said, 500 people in this youth wing. He ended up moving to Chicago, and he was a very gifted student, very gifted athlete, had like his whole life ahead of him, as they always say. It's funny, I actually read a Nation article from the Nation, the publication, dated from 1976, and they identified him as a young man who was very, it was very possible for him to enter a white society if he wanted to, right? Star athlete, star student, honor student, could have done anything, pre-law, you know what I mean? Like, this was a guy who, if he wanted to, he could have assimilated, but he didn't. He moved to Chicago, he got involved with the Black Panther Party, and at this time, again, we have to understand there was a multi-party effort, right, to break up these radical groups, you know, and when we say radical groups, that means the Black Panther Party. It also includes the Young Lords. It also includes the Young Patriots, and it actually includes street gangs. You know, I know that I'm a kid born in the 90s, right? And so like I grew up with all the talks of like, you know, street gangs as this sort of like almost feral, animalistic kind of thing, right? That's how I was taught like what a street gang is. But people like Fred Hampton, people in the Black Panther Party, you know, I think it was Malcolm X who referred to street gangs as depoliticized street gangs, or street tribes is how he put it, right? These people who understood how to take care of each other and resist the police and resist the state, but they were doing it without a political message, right? So at this time, you had all of this, these people who knew how to organize on the street, knew how to take care of each other, knew how to fight, honestly. I mean, that's important. But they didn't have a political message. They weren't unified, right? So one of the first things that you saw Fred Hampton do before, of course, his untimely murder, was try to unite these street gangs, right? And this is missed from his story. We don't talk about that as much.
They thought they thought the Black Panthers were another gang that wanted turf. And he said, I don't want your turf, man. If you want to join the Black Panthers, feel free, but I don't want turf. And he had them actually working on some constructive and positive things in conjunction with the Black Panthers.
Precisely.
He reached out to these gangs and said, the police violence is being perpetrated against you, so join me in opposing the police violence.
Yeah, he was radically anti-violent too, nonviolent. I just want to read a quote from him that I found online. We've got to face the fact that some people say you fight fire best with fire, but we say you put fire out best with water. We say you don't fight racism with racism. We're going to fight racism with solidarity. We say you don't fight capitalism with black capitalism. You fight capitalism with socialism. And those words have just been echoing in my mind ever since I read them, because it's such a radical message that resonates so much with the street protests going on right now.
It does. And I think that you see the legacy of that quote, which is something that I'm glad you read it, because it's been rattling in my brain for years since I first heard it. And I think you see it now. You see a lot of people who don't really want co-optation from, nonprofit groups or these sort of make nice sort of like, well, let's all assimilate back into a good society. People don't want that right now. And he didn't want that either.
Can't we just return to normal?
Right. Yeah. And you see people, a lot of young people, a lot of radical people, and there are more every day, rejecting that message. It's hard to say that when we have Joe Biden as our candidate for president. But you see my point. The people in the street, and there's more of them every day, are the ones kind of rejecting that idea. And that is, to me, the legacy of what he put out there. Because as you said, Justin, he was a pretty nonviolent. He wasn't opposed to self-defense, as we may get into, but he didn't want necessarily like a militia,
Right.
And he actually, and this is very relevant to his death as well, there were members of the Black Panther Party that he worked with directly who were very aggressive and were constantly saying we should be doing more violence, we need to be arming, en masse, we need to start setting traps in our apartments and stuff for invaders and stuff. And he intentionally, rejected that. Like he knew right away what that was and knew on the danger of that. And he rejected it. He said, we're not doing that. We're not going that path, and this is why he was seen as such a threat, and that is when you see it. And I've seen some reports and stuff that said that he really popped up on the FBI's radar as a major, major threat. That's how they categorized him. Mm-hmm. When he started this, nonviolent coalition building, right? When he was uniting street gangs, brokering peace treaties, when he was reaching out to the Young Lords, which was a Latino organization, and the Young Patriots, which was a white organization, right?
Why would he become a threat because of that?
Because I think in those moments, I think that the powers that be, whether it be Hanrahan or you move up the ladder at J. Edgar Hoover, Richard Nixon, any of these people, they understood that a class-based organization, right, that could put their guns down for a minute and get in a room and talk about who is our common opponent here. Mm-hmm. What are we fighting over, and why are we stuck fighting over just a piece of turf? Mm. I'm starting to sound like the opening monologue from The Warriors, if you guys have ever seen that movie, but I'm going to have to watch it again. I'm going to make both of you watch that movie. What are you doing? Okay. That movie's way older than me.
Yes,
anyway. But, they stopped arguing over these pieces of turf, and they started arguing over who's making us fight over these pieces of turf. Who's making us this desperate?
Great. That is so awesome. That is so awesome.
And that's the question. And that is what Fred was trying to do. He was trying to do this with his political education, which he was starting political education classes in Chicago for free for children. No Patreon, no subscriber list, nothing like that. It's just, come as you are. As well as doing free breakfast programs.
Yeah.
These are moments where the people said, we don't need you, talking to the state. We need us. Mm-hmm. We need each other, mm-hmm. right? Whether you're white, whatever color you might be, right? And he has said as much. He gave a speech after Hanrahan targeted him the first time, and he said, what they have us doing right now is saying, well, I'm black and I hate brown people. I'm brown, I hate yellow people. I'm yellow, I hate white people. I'm white, I hate black people. And you go in this cycle, right? And he said that that's not the enemy, right? The enemy is above that. And that is what made him a threat.
Our topic today here on Truth to Power on Forward Radio is Fred Hampton. We're taking a look back at history to use it to inform our movement today, because Fred Hampton really should inform, his story really should inform our way going forward. And we have so many lessons to learn from the short life of this man who was a leader in the Black Panther Party and was killed by police in Chicago in 1969 at the tender age of 21. I'm Justin Mogg. I'm speaking today with Jake Bush from Democratic Socialists of America Louisville chapter, and Hart Hagan, host of the Climate Report and Let's Talk. And I really want to, if we could focus a little bit on the work of coalition building in Fred's life. It wasn't just that he was trying to be nonviolent and bring these street gangs together, but he really was the one who founded this whole idea of the Rainbow Coalition, right? And that was a uniting of several different, we're talking about SDS, Students for Democratic Society, AIM, the Brown Berets, all these different groups that were working towards common vision. And I see that today in our movement today as well. And if we could build a Rainbow Coalition for today, I think we'd have a lot more strength as a people. What do you all think about that?
Well, I'm on board with that.
I'm in.
So Martin Luther King talked about how the people at the very top divide black and white people from one another. Mm-hmm. And, so
I think,
I don't know what else to say about that, except that more and more I see that. And, I see when I encounter hate speech and when I can encounter hateful attitudes, it's easy to respond with the same kind of strident attitude. And I'm not beyond that, but right. I'm saying those hateful attitudes are cultivated over the course of time. They're cultivated by like black exploitation comedy. I mean, I used to be an Eddie Murphy fan, and I realize now that a lot of his stuff is punching down. A lot of the fictional, like the TV and movies and comedy, is making some lowly person look ridiculous instead of punching up and making the powers that be look ridiculous. So we have this rich cultural vocabulary of things that make average people look silly and ridiculous. And that's the type of, that's the very rich dividing us from one another.
It's funny you mentioned that. So like, I feel like my generation's Eddie Murphy was Dave Chappelle, when he left his show on Comedy Central, pretty successful show, well acclaimed, a show that I'd still find absolutely hilarious, honestly. But, he left it after only 2 seasons. And he said that the reason why was because he's like, I started really looking at the audience and thinking, what are they really laughing at? What is making them laugh? Because I don't think that they're laughing for the reasons I'm laughing. You know what I mean?
Right.
And I think that's a good point, that you see it across all media. You see it across the news, comedy, anything. You know what I mean? These sort of divisive things, poking fun at people rather than, sort of sharing a laugh, which is a very different thing.
The people at the very top can be, they do ridiculous things. They say ridiculous things. It wouldn't be, there's a lot of material there, but if you want to get funded, it's a whole different thing. But let me read this speech, part of a speech from Fred Hampton. This was delivered like within a year before he died. He said, we ain't gonna, okay. Tell me what you think of any of this, either violence or calling cops pigs. I mean, let's talk. We ain't going to fight no reactionary pigs who run up and down the street being reactionary. we're going to organize and dedicate ourselves to revolutionary political power and teach ourselves the specific needs of resisting the power structure, arm ourselves, and we're going to fight reactionary pigs with international proletarian revolution.
Wow.
That's what it has to be. The people have to have the power. It belongs to the people. We have to understand very clearly that there's a man in our community called a capitalist. Sometimes he's black and sometimes he's white. But that man has to be driven out of our community, because anyone who comes into the community to make a profit off the people by exploiting them can be defined as a capitalist. Let me just stop right there. I used to love Michael Jordan, and as an athlete, he was wonderful. But damn, I'm wanting to cuss, but we're on the air. I mean, he's worth $2 billion now. Much of it from endorsement of Nike. Nike, uses slave labor overseas and charges over $100 for a pair of shoes that are promoted by famous athletes and often sold to ghetto kids. That's exploitation.
But Republicans buy sneakers too.
Yeah. Oh, so it's equal opportunity exploitation.
That's his famous quote. You can't piss him off because
he said that.
You can't. Hey, well, that's what he said. You can't make them mad. They buy sneakers too, right?
Right. All right. So he goes on to say, and we don't care how many programs they have, how long a dashiki they have. Dashiki is an African garb. How long a dashiki they have, because political power does not flow from the sleeve of a dashiki. Political power flows from the barrel of a gun. It flows from the barrel of a gun.
Wow.
I have a thought here.
Okay.
Right? So that line that you ended with, or he ended with, that's Mao. That's Chairman Mao.
Yeah.
That's directly from Chairman Mao.
Mm-hmm.
And it's important to note that, because the Black Panther Party, and if you want to talk about the context, the life and times, like where were they situated in terms of power, and then the context of the history here. The Black Panther Party was specifically organized around Maoist tendencies, right? And I know that's scary, and I understand. I'm not going to sit here and apologize for Mao's regime in China. I have no interest in having that argument at all.
Jake, there are cartoon heroes and there are cartoon villains. You have to be one or the other.
One of them wears a white hat.
The
other wears a black hat.
Right.
I get
the American way.
Right. Yeah, I don't even want to go there. But what I will say is that the reason
everybody is either good or bad. You can't be both.
Right. It's two different cups. You're in one or the other. But it's important to note that, because it's important to recognize that the Black Panther Party and Fred Hampton himself understood Black people as a colonized people within the nation of their colonizer, right? It's sort of a unique situation that is very similar to the Chinese people who engaged in a revolution, right, under Chairman Mao. It's people who understood we are a people who live in the same nation as our colonizer, and yet we are treated as a colony. Our homes are treated as ghettos, right, where we are forced into, right? I mean, that's where the term comes from. It's a place where you put an oppressed people intentionally to ostracize them from the rest of society. That's why they call it a ghetto. You know what I mean? And so Hampton understood that you must understand, not in terms of Black nationalism in the sense that it's Black people only, nobody else, no solidarity, but Black nationalism in the sense of self-determination.
Right.
And that's a very important distinction that I feel like gets missed a lot, because he explicitly says, he says, and he uses the term racist, which I wouldn't call a Black nationalist necessarily racist, because that gets into question of power and all these other very messy things. But he's saying, I don't fight racism with racism, I fight it with solidarity, as you all said. And what he means is, it's going to take the unification of people who are oppressed across this entire world banding together, whether it's Asian Americans and Black Americans, Palestinians, right? People in China, people in, wherever across the world who are experiencing oppression, coming together for their self-determination. That's what it's all about. And if you look at anything Hampton was talking about, if you look at any of the Black Panther Party's 10 points, the constant is self-determination for their community.
And that colonization exists today, obviously, for Black and brown people, but for white working class people as well. You could easily call Appalachia colonized, right? Colonized by the fossil fuel industry, for instance, and our Ohio River Valley continues to be colonized in that way.
I think so.
And so this is where I always get a little stuck about, well, do we need Black self-determination or do we need people's self-determination, right? And I think I think there's respect for both positions. I don't have one or the other, but that combining that critique about lack of self-determination with the Maoist sort of class and economic critique, I think is what made the Panther Party such a powerful movement of its time, and why it was so frightening to the powers that be, and that's why this whole COINTELPRO program was set up to identify and infiltrate and eliminate, disrupt leadership, and it eventually ended in Fred Hampton's death in 1969. We had a great outline for how this conversation was going to go, and I love how we've just gone off in tentacles. So I don't know if we want to return to that outline, Hart.
We're anarchists.
It's anarchist radio here on right. 105.
You're calling a red an anarchist right now. I don't know how to respond to it. I mean, it's fine. Solidarity. It's fine. I'm wearing the shirt, man. I'm wearing the shirt. But no, if I may respond to that briefly. Just a quick snippet from a speech that Hart sent over to me to look over before this, actually. The very first line of the speech, 1969, power anywhere where there's people. I think that would be his response to what you were saying, Justin, of this kind of sticky situation. And it is a sticky situation. When you talk about self-determination of Black people, self-determination of Appalachian white people, let's say, and he's saying power anywhere where there is people, right? That the power needs to be in the people's hands. And he explicitly says, and he uses a term that I don't really feel comfortable using for Black people, but he says, I don't want imperialist Black people, right? That was another part of one of his quotes where he was saying, we talk about rising up of Black people. He's like, well, I don't want imperialist Black people. That's not. If
you want to look at colonialization, there's always a crony within the country. If it's Latin America, if it's Africa, if it's the Middle East, no matter where it is, you go into the country and you buy somebody. That's modern colonialism. Whereas the British conquering India or parts of Africa would just go in and establish a colonial government. We don't do it that way. We pay off a crony to oppress the native people. So there's always, it's like Cornel West was saying, what we got now is a more colorful power structure. You've got people of color and women sprinkled within the power structure, but it's the same power structure.
Yeah, and that's why his calls for revolution are so poignant to me. Because when he's talking about revolution, we always think, oh, it's a big scary word, it's a big scary thing. And sure, I mean, things have to change. That's what the word means. But it has to change. You see what I'm saying? I know that this is another fine distinction here, but what he's saying is the very way that the system works has to change for it to actually be a revolutionary change, right? It can't be, well, we swapped the person in charge out. You know what I mean? It has to fundamentally change the relationship of working people to the process of production and accumulation for it to count, And in that case, I see what he's saying here as a major threat, because if people were able to have followed Hampton more closely, and of course he was taken from us, but if his message had stuck around and he had been able to organize the way that he looked like he was poised to do, perhaps we would have seen that take hold, and we would have seen people less placated, right, by the change, which is we keep the system functionally the same. It's just we sort of swap out people and make it more representative. which is something that he absolutely was not in favor of.
Some of our listeners are thirsty for violence, so we should talk about the circumstances surrounding.
Oh my God, it's getting intense.
Anyway, that's my awkward segue into
Blood on the radio.
Yeah, right.
If it bleeds, it leads here on Forward Radio. Yeah. Let's talk about the circumstances that surrounded Fred's death. This was December 3rd of 1969, right?
Right.
Take the lead on that one.
Okay. So on December 3rd, so prior to this, Hanrahan is the prosecutor who basically made this happen. Prior to this, you have J. Edgar Hoover, who's the head of the FBI, orchestrating all this. This has been revealed in the memos. So keep in mind that this is orchestrated. This is not something just a raid gone bad, or the cops had no legitimate reason to be there. But the circumstances surrounding Fred's death, on December 3rd, Fred taught at a church, and some Panther members spent the night at his apartment, which was normal. The people in the apartment that spent the night with him included Deborah Johnson, his fiancée, who was 9 months pregnant with their son, and also Blair Anderson, James Grady, Ronald Doc Satchel, Harold Bell, Verlena Brewer, Louis Trulock, Brenda Harris, and Mark Clark. So there's about 9 or 10 people total in this apartment. I'm not sure if the cops knew or understood that, but it was certainly, anyway. So O'Neill is a person who had been a spy. He was an infiltrator who worked with the FBI. So O'Neill prepared the dinner and drugged Fred Hampton. The drug was Seconal, or secobarbital. It's a sedative that they wanted to drug him so that he wouldn't resist. They just wanted him to be vulnerable for the murder. So Hampton fell asleep, after being drugged. Hampton fell asleep mid-sentence talking to his mother on the phone. Fred Hampton didn't use drugs or drink alcohol, so it would have been very unusual and unexpected for him to ingest this himself. And I think O'Neill has admitted to all this after years and years. He hadn't even admitted to it as of the civil trial a few years later. But here's the armed raid. They said arms raid. I'm not sure if that's arms raid or armed raid. If it's arms raid, that means they're looking for arms. So the cops are supposedly looking for illegal weapons. So at 4 a.m., the heavily armed police team arrived at the site, divided into 2 teams, 8 for the front of the building and 6 for the rear. At 4:45 a.m., they stormed into the apartment. Mark Clark, sitting in the front room of the apartment with a shotgun in his lap, was on security duty. So they were defending themselves against the police, and now you know why.
They knew, they knew this was coming.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, only 1 shot was fired in the other direction. There were like 50 shots shot inward and only 1 shot out, and that was by accident. The police shot him in the chest, killing him instantly. That's Mark Clark. An alternative account says that Clark answered the door and police immediately shot him. Either way, Clark's gun discharged once into the ceiling. The single round was fired when he suffered a reflexive death convulsion after being shot. This was the only shot fired by the Panthers. So Hampton, drugged by barbiturates, was sleeping on a mattress in the bedroom with his fiancée, Deborah Johnson, who was 9 months pregnant with their child.
Oh.
She was forcibly removed from the room by police.
Well, see, if it was today and this was Breonna Taylor, they'd just shoot her.
Yeah, they just shoot her too, yeah. So that's progress.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
Then the raiding team, the raiding team fired at the head of the south bedroom. Hampton was wounded in the shoulder by the shooting. Fellow Black Panther Harold Bell said that he heard the following exchange. This is the cops talking. "That's Fred Hampton. Is he dead? Bring him out. He is barely alive. he'll make it. Now, usually he'll make it is good news, but in this case, he'll make it means finish him off.
Wow.
So the injured Panthers said they heard 2 shots. So this is the people that were there. One was killed instantly. The rest were gathered into the living room. And only Fred was left in the back room, and he was sedated. So the injured Panthers said they heard 2 shots. According to Hampton's supporters, the shots were fired point blank at Hampton's head. According to Deborah Johnson, an officer then said, "He's good and dead now."
Wow.
Hampton's body was dragged into the doorway of the bedroom and left in a pool of blood. So those are the circumstances surrounding. So when I first heard about this from Noam Chomsky, Chomsky he's an animal when it comes to reading the original documents. And I thought you had to be somebody with his zeal and intellect to dig behind the scenes to find out what really happens. But any idiot can look at it if these facts are remotely true. And all of this came out during the trials. There was a criminal trial of the people that were herded into the room. They were charged with crimes and they had to defend themselves. They had to pay, they at first were responsible for $100,000 cash bail.
Wow.
And then, so those charges were eventually acquitted on those charges. The police and the prosecutor were ultimately charged in a criminal trial. That was an uphill battle, and they ended up being acquitted as well. But then the civil trial, so when you get to crimes have to be proved beyond a reasonable doubt, but a civil case like suing for civil rights violations, it's preponderance of the evidence. It's more likely than not that this happened and that the government should pay this money. So the governments, the FBI and the government of Chicago and the government of Cook County ended up paying $1.85 million to these people. That was the case, even though the judge, there's a Judge Perry over the civil trial who could not have been more biased and he was obstructing the case every step of the way. He could not have been more hostile to the plaintiffs than he was. But when it went to appeal, the appeals court ended up overturning the trial. Either that or it went back to a new trial. I forget which. But in either case, the court system, as biased as it was against Fred Hampton and his estate and the other Black Panthers, ended up awarding, and the FBI, ended up having to pay a third of that $1.85 million. And when you dig into the details, you end up knowing why. I mean, the FBI there was a document in their files that was basically one of these people, William O'Neill, had done a diagram of the bedroom. Wow. It's like, here is the bed, anyway, once the evidence is, and then at the time of this incident, that we didn't know anything about COINTELPRO, but COINTELPRO became a public knowledge, a matter of public knowledge after this. So,
1971.
Okay.
Yeah, I was hoping you were going to bring that up because that was what I was going to go in with.
Well, to the uninitiated, what's COINTELPRO?
Well, so 1971, there was a break-in in an FBI field office, and one of the documents that was stolen and released was proof that COINTELPRO existed, right? Now, COINTELPRO was a program by the FBI. The shorthand I use is that basically they were doing what the CIA was doing to everybody else, but inside the United States, right?
Right.
So I know that's the shorthand, but that's honestly what it was.
Equal opportunity surveillance and persecution.
Exactly.
It's the war at home, right? Everything we send abroad bounces back to get us here.
Always.
The people are the enemy.
That's the perspective of the ruling class. We're talking here on Truth to Power on Forward Radio about Fred Hampton and his legacy. Amazing how few people know about Fred Hampton and his legacy, but also how much he was able to achieve before he was murdered by the FBI at the age of 21. This really resonates with the situation today. I mean, we haven't seen much progress since 1969. If we want to talk about how much resources your taxpayer dollars go towards violence abroad and at home, right? And when we talk about this 1.85 million settlement, that's taxpayer dollars, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
It's you and me paying off.
It's either that or it's money they've earned dealing drugs.
Yeah.
Seriously. And that sort of brings us back to this COINTELPRO thing where the major thing was to infiltrate groups that were deemed to be dangerous, right, to the sanctity of America. And basically what the entire plan was to infiltrate with their own...
They're a threat to regular Americans.
Regular tax-paying Americans. We all love that dog whistle. But the main thing was to either secure informants or get agents to go undercover to infiltrate these groups and not just tell the FBI and the police department about what they're doing, right? Because, I think Jeffrey Haas, he gave an interview with Democracy Now! Some time ago, and he said, I always thought of an informant as somebody who sits back in the back and they take notes and then they, listen, they don't say anything, they take notes and then they give them off to the FBI. He said that's not really what was going on. The people that the FBI were using in these programs were instigators, they were agitators, right? And this is why Hampton was very smart to not listen to the most violent, the most irrational kind of people in his organization, because come to find out, they were the very people who were working with the FBI. And this is a common tactic, even to this day, where,
So when we're in a DSA meeting, the person screaming loudest for, I don't know, a strike.
Yeah. Well, we need to go burn down this building or something. Like, you're a cop. Right. Not that I've ever heard that in a DSA meeting. Whoever's listening to this have not heard that.
Right.
But
not that we will admit.
But you actually see this now with right-wing militias. Actually, this is still an issue where the FBI, and I know that I'm not really friendly with right-wing militias, big shocker there, but I think it is worth noting that they still do this tactic where they will send people undercover and say, well, hey man, why don't we blow up this mosque? Why don't we just shoot up this mall or something like that? That guy is usually the FBI agent.
Well, there was an incident when the protests were just getting started. There was an incident where 7 people were shot. I don't think anybody died in that, but the person just disappeared. It had to be a professional. It couldn't have been. Anyway, just saying.
Yeah, it's worth speculating because again, if we're talking about the legacy of Fred Hampton, we're talking about, again, the most violent people, the most violent-minded people in his organization were the people paid by the FBI. We're talking about, the production.
And when it comes down to it, they're not going to be prosecuted. They can do violent things and not get prosecuted for it because they're, they said the FBI and the CIA has got their backs.
Absolutely. And we're not just talking about this. We're talking about the production of propaganda, where certain members would produce propaganda or political cartoons or something like that. And then that would be disseminated and they would cause strife between these groups in the Rainbow Coalition. Like Justin, you were talking about how Hampton worked very hard to build this coalition. And one way the FBI would go about that is they would, get in the ear of a member of the Black Panther Party or another organization and say, why don't you publish this here political cartoon, and it would always paint a member of the SDS or SNCC or the Young Patriots or something in a negative light. And then that would cause sometimes violent, sometimes murderous conflicts between those groups because they would essentially be playing like the telephone game with the FBI at one end.
They tried to do that here. They tried to, create some enmity between Fred Hampton and somebody else to get that, but that didn't work. So they had to do it themselves.
Precisely.
And, this strategy by the authorities to infiltrate and to provoke violence, I don't know if it's responsible for the Weather Underground, but it worked in the sense that the Weather Underground formed and really started doing its attacks right after Fred Hampton's murder. And it was just 2 days later, on December 6th, that members of the Weather Underground destroyed a number of police vehicles in a retaliatory bombing spree on Halsted Street in Chicago. So this really kicked off that kind of crazy period of the early 70s with the Weather Underground and the bombings.
And you know, this is something I think a lot, like since I've been involved in the protests here in Louisville, you know, we've talked about I've been arrested, whatever, blah, blah, blah. But like the thing that I noticed just being on the ground and watched the way the police responded to these protests is they have it in their minds that the thing to do is take out the leader, right? And this is just basic tactics. Any 10-year-old who's played, you know, some video game or something will tell you, yeah, you go after the toughest guy and then the rest scatter. And that's precisely what happened here. You go after Hampton because he was the unifier. In street protests, you go after whoever's organizing the street protest. You don't even have to arrest them. You don't have to hurt them. You don't have to touch them. Just separate them from the rest of the people. Yeah. And then the people scatter. And a lot of the times they bring with themselves their own initiatives, their own agendas, their own thoughts, and they're not organized. You know what I mean? And so anybody listening to this who's not a cop, you know, if you're listening to this at home, the thing to keep in mind is if you have leaders in your organization, do not let them get separated from the people, because that is when things get unorganized. That
what do you mean separated?
Whether it's arrest, whether it's death, whether it's being just taken off of a platform where they can speak. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, at a protest, whoever's got the megaphone, who's leading the march, so to speak, once that megaphone's out of their hands, people are left rudderless. They're left leaderless. They're left adrift. And while I understand that spontaneous political action can be inspiring and moving and can actually achieve real results, I'm not going to argue with that. Spontaneous political action is also unorganized political action most of the time. And that's why, you know, Justin, you were talking about the Weather Underground doing these attacks on police vehicles. I'm not going to get into the ethics of is this good or bad in a universal sense, but was it productive?
Violence favors the establishment. The establishment can respond with violence, and that legitimizes their...
At a greater degree than you ever could.
Yeah, the Weather Underground...
And so the establishment has the incentive to what am I trying to say? Fulminate or
Foment.
Yeah, they can fulminate too if they want to, but they can foment. They have the incentive to foment violence. The worst thing for them is for there to be unity without violence, working class unity without violence. That's the worst thing for them.
Yeah, and that doesn't necessarily mean that people can't defend themselves. You know, I mean, right. Fred Hampton himself, you know, one of the things that he and the Black Panther Party talked a lot about was self-defense, because that's a part of self-determination that, you know, if you're infringing upon me, I should have a right to push you back a little bit. But that's a very different thing from an offensive violence. You see what I'm saying? Because as you were saying, Hart, that's always going to favor the powers that be. They can respond with legitimate violence in far greater capacity than any, you know, small scale militia, especially in this day and age with the technology we have. You know, they can do far more than you could dream of, you know, and it never make the news even.
Yeah, well, let's look at Black Lives Matter. So this is something that I have heard, and I kind of it is consistent with what I see, and that is Black Lives Matter is kind of prevented from being all that organized, because if there are leaders, then those leaders can be given 9 kinds of hell by the system. You know, they can be, the leaders can be charged with crimes, for one thing. Not hard to charge a person of color with a crime, and it has nothing, their confinement has nothing to do with justice. No. So the Black Lives Matter is prevented from being very well, or even though they are but they can't do as much because of the way the system is always putting the heat on leaders.
That's something I think about a lot. I think about that a lot in this sort of discussion of spontaneity and leadership and who should be in charge and blah, blah, blah. There's all sorts of within the group sort of discussions, and not just Black Lives Matter, which of course I'm not as inside of, right? I'm very white. I don't need to be. But my point is that I think about this a lot, and I think that, I think that the model of the 60s is not a model that can be replicated. Just on what is possible. You know what I mean? I think that we are in a day and age where media moves very fast, information moves very fast. I think people now want more transparency, and people want more of a sense of, spontaneity. And I don't see the same kind of leadership model coming about today, partially for the reasons you were saying, Hart. They've sort of, the system has sort of already, it's almost like antibodies, right? Like they've adjusted, they've built up the sort of defense to that model. Mm-hmm. So some other new model is going to have to come about. And that's why I get so frustrated talking to some people on the left who are like, well, what we need to do, and they have their little books and their notebooks and chart, like we need to go back to this and that and look at this model. This worked in this particular revolution in 18, whatever. And I'm like, you don't understand history, okay? What happened, and it's over. Like we're feeling the effects. Like history lives. History is a living thing. Yes, that's true. But it happened then. We are no longer in that time with a particular historical and social and economic context. We're in a new one. We have to have a model that reflects our current context of history and social, relations and the economy of the time. You know what I mean? And frankly, I don't think that in this moment we'll ever be able to understand exactly what that paradigm is or what's desirable. I think that's something 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, we'll look back and be able to make an assessment of it. Unfortunately, that's just the way I think history works. But that's a great point, Hart. I don't think there's any clear answer, is what I'm trying to say. I don't think we could have that answer right now.
Thank you. Let me, the Black Panthers had 10 points, and I don't want to read all of them, but I want to read the first few and see what we think. So it's what we want now. Number one, we want freedom. We want power to determine the destiny of our Black community. We want full employment for our people. We want an end to the robbery by capitalists of our Black and oppressed communities. We want decent housing fit for the shelter of human beings. We want education for our people that exposes the true nature of this American society. We want education that teaches us our true history and our role in the present day society. So that number 5 is like, my personal passion is for people to understand the reality, separate the rhetoric from the reality. What I learned, and I only, I'm 57 years old, it's only about like 2.5 years ago that I started to learn what utter hogwash the history I have learned is. And, knowledge of the problem is half the solution. Awareness of the problem is half the solution. And so we're, today we're doing something, we are, understanding. I like what it says about, we want people to understand the true nature of this decadent American society, the true nature of our society, how the police and the FBI and the CIA can plan to murder somebody, and they do it and they get away with it. And 50 years later, hardly anybody knows about this.
And unfortunately, we're all out of time, but that's a really good point to end on, Hart. I'm glad you shared that. My name is Justin Mogg, host of Sustainability Now. I want to thank Jake Bush from DSA Louisville for joining us today for this great conversation about Fred Hampton. And DSA Louisville is continuing their day and night schools. I know there's a Q&A coming up on August 27th. Do you happen to know about that, Jake, with Dustin and Jared?
Yeah. Dustin and Jared, they're very long time DSA organizers. They've definitely been around the block, and they are talking about the party surrogate model. So we're going to talk about, in the wake of the Bernie Sanders campaign, what does a socialist involvement with electoral campaigns look like? So I think that's a big thing. Everybody try to tune in if you can.
Green Party.
Get at us on social media, and we will have that for everybody. Everybody's free to join. So
yeah, find that dsalouisville.org, August 27th at 6 p.m. And Hart Hagan, host of the Climate Report and Let's Talk. Anything you want to promote, Hart?
Well, I'm talking this week about the wisdom of life consists in the elimination of non-essentials. Like, what can we get rid of? Like 90% of cars, 90% of air travel, 90% of defense. Don't get me started.
Great. Sounds good. So stay tuned for that on Forward Radio, and we'll be back in your ears again in 1 week's time. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Great job, y'all. Thank you.